Boston, summer of 1991. Rain drizzled steadily across the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill as 26-year-old Isabel Thompson, living with her widowed mother in a red-brick townhouse and working at a cozy downtown bookstore, paused at a crosswalk. The damp air smelled faintly of wet pavement and history. She noticed him, an elderly man with a polished wooden cane, bearing a military insignia, a battered leather portfolio in hand. His posture, though aged, hinted at quiet discipline. When she offered her hand to help him across the street, he looked at her with a soft British accent and a faraway expression. His gaze seemed lost between now and then. Later that evening, as rain tapped a slow rhythm against the window panes, Isabel climbed to the attic of her mother's Victorian home to sort through dusty boxes. In one tie-wrapped bundle, she discovered a stack of yellowed letters dated from the early 1940s, all signed Edward H., RAF sergeant stationed in England during World War II, who corresponded, as revealed in the letters, with a young American woman living in Boston during wartime. Tucked inside was a fading black-and-white photograph, his face unmistakably the same one she had helped across Beacon Street. Though decades old, the letters pulsed with life, words of longing, hope, and stolen time. The handwriting was careful, brimming with affection and quiet resolve. Isabel could almost hear his voice behind each sentence. She felt the gravity of an unexplored story, one that connected her unexpected encounter with an entire hidden past, waiting to unfold. If this story moved you as it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That small gesture helps us share more real, inspiring, and surprising stories. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next will change everything. Isabel sat cross-legged in the attic that night, the dim bulb casting golden pools of light across the worn floorboards and dust motes dancing in silence, while her fingers gently unfolded the fragile letters, each one tinged with the scent of time and secrets. Not just artifacts from a war long past, but echoes of a love that refused to vanish quietly into the shadows of history. The letters, written between 1943 and 1945, were from Edward Hargreaves, a Royal Air Force sergeant stationed at a military liaison post in upstate New York, part of an Allied program that coordinated British-American intelligence and training during the war. A historical footnote Isabel vaguely remembered from her college classes, now unfolding in her lap as something deeply, achingly personal. Each envelope was addressed in careful looping script to a Miss Helen Donovan, her mother. And as Isabel read, the lines became less like messages from a stranger and more like whispers from a man who had once been very real to her mother, whose voice now somehow felt familiar, though they had never spoken beyond that single encounter on the street. Edward's writing painted a vivid portrait of a time most Americans understood only through films and textbooks: late-night walks beneath blackout skies, dances in makeshift canteens, jazz drifting from radios set low in kitchen windows, and the constant, pressing fear that each shared moment could be their last. And through it all ran one thread: Helen. The way he described her made Isabel see her mother in a light she had never imagined, not just as a reserved woman with carefully ironed skirts and predictable routines, but as a young girl full of wit, sharp intelligence, and a deep, fierce sense of loyalty. Isabel read about meetings outside the Boston Public Library, a bench in the public garden that became their place, and late-night telephone calls that ended too soon when curfews rang through the lines. They shared poems, books, dreams of peace, and tentative talk of the future, a quiet hope that when the war ended they might have a chance to build a life together. And then, suddenly, the tone of the letters changed. In the final envelope, dated October 1945, Edward wrote of an unexpected recall order, vague talk of a mission that required his immediate return to England, and a haunting line near the bottom: "If they let me come back, I will. Please wait for me." That was it. No further letters followed, no explanations, no goodbyes. Isabel held the final page in trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the lines again and again, as if new meaning might rise from the creases. It was as though someone had ripped out the last chapter of a book and left only the echo of what should have come next. Until that moment, Isabel had accepted her mother's story of her childhood without much question, that her father, a quiet, gentle man named Thomas, had died of cancer when she was 6, and that Helen had rarely spoken of the time before that marriage. There were hints, of course, vague remarks about a complicated youth, a few old photographs Isabel had once found tucked in the back of a drawer, but never anything as direct or raw as this. Now, holding Edward's words, Isabel felt something shift inside her, not just curiosity or longing, but a visceral connection to a man she had met for no more than a few seconds, and who, improbably, seemed to share the curve of her jaw, the shape of her brow, the very cadence of her silence. She walked to the hallway mirror, still holding the photograph, and stared at the side-by-side reflections, one faded in monochrome, the other breathing and present, and yet undeniably similar. Could it be? Could Edward Hargreaves be her biological father? The question took root instantly, not as speculation, but as a question of identity, of legacy. Had her mother known? Had Edward tried to return? Had someone, family, military, fate itself, stood in their way? For the rest of the night, Isabel couldn't sleep. She laid the letters out in order on the bed, surrounded herself with their quiet voices, and began taking notes, cross-referencing dates, street names, any detail that could help her make sense of it all. She searched public archives online, scanned old Boston City records, even found a military liaison registry from the war that confirmed an E. Hargreaves had indeed been assigned to the area during the exact years mentioned in the letters. By dawn, she knew one thing with certainty. This was not a dream or a coincidence. The man she had helped across the street, the man with the weary eyes and the hesitant smile, was real, and he had once loved her mother in a way that still resonated through paper, ink, and time. And Isabel wouldn't let that story end in silence. Over the next few days, Isabel found herself walking the city differently, not just moving through Boston's familiar sidewalks and cobblestone alleys as she always had, but scanning every face, every figure at a crosswalk, as if somehow the man from the photograph, from the letters, and from that brief rainy afternoon would appear again and simply recognize her. Unable to bear the silence of unanswered questions, she reached out to the only person she could think of who might know where to start. Father McKay, the aging priest from the old Holy Trinity Church in the South End, a friend of her mother's from long ago, and someone who had, over the years, become a quiet confidant for many of the neighborhood's older residents. She brought him coffee and the photograph. At first, he squinted at the image, confused, and then his eyes widened just slightly. Not with recognition exactly, but with a sort of startled possibility. "I know someone who fits this," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "There's a home in Cambridge, one of ours, for veterans with memory loss. There's a man there who doesn't talk much, but he keeps an old RAF badge on his nightstand." Isabel's heart thudded in her chest as she gently placed her hand over the letters inside her tote bag. 2 days later, after calling ahead and receiving cautious approval to visit, she stood in the softly lit hallway of St. Michael's Veteran Care Home, her palms damp and her breath shallow as she followed a nurse toward the garden. It was late afternoon, the kind of early September light that made everything appear wrapped in gold. There he was, sitting quietly on a bench beneath a maple tree, his back straight despite his age, his cane resting beside him, his hands folded calmly in his lap. When she approached, he didn't look up at first. It was only when she softly said, "Mr. Hargreaves," that he lifted his eyes, studying her as though trying to place a half-remembered face from a dream. "Lena?" he asked, his voice hesitant and fragile. Isabel froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, but I'm her daughter." His face changed in that moment, not suddenly, but like sunlight gradually passing over a long shaded room. He looked at her not as a stranger, but with something close to reverence, as if time itself had bent to let him see a glimpse of what might have been. She sat beside him, saying nothing for a long while. Then slowly, she reached into her bag and handed him one of the letters, folded, worn, and carried now with intention. Edward took it with trembling hands. His fingers lingered on the paper, and then, without opening it, he began to recite it, word for word, his voice soft, almost lyrical. "I remember writing this," he said, "under a lamp in my barracks. I didn't know if she'd read it. I prayed she would." Over the next few weeks, Isabel returned again and again, sometimes with letters, sometimes with stories, sometimes just with silence. And with each visit, Edward seemed to grow more lucid, more anchored to the present through the reawakening of the past. He told her about Helen's laugh, about her stubbornness, about the way she folded her arms when she was trying not to cry. He spoke of the public garden bench, of her love for Emily Dickinson, and of a single night during an air raid drill when they danced slowly in a darkened kitchen, the war momentarily kept at bay by music played too softly on a gramophone. He spoke, too, of the night he left, of the rushed orders, of how he wrote as many letters as he could during the voyage home, and how, after months of silence, he assumed she had moved on. "I never stopped writing," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. But maybe the letters were never meant to reach her. Isabel listened, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, not just for the young man who had been silenced by distance and bureaucracy, but for her mother, who had never spoken of this love, this fracture, this wound that had quietly shaped the woman Isabel had known her whole life. There was no doubt anymore, no speculation, no imagination needed. The man who sat beside her, fragile, fading, but fiercely human, had once loved her mother with a depth and conviction that defied time. And now Isabel knew she couldn't carry this truth alone. It was time to speak with Helen, not as a daughter seeking stories, but as a woman trying to heal a history written in silence. It was a late Sunday afternoon when Isabel sat across from her mother at the worn oak kitchen table, the same table where school books had once been spread, where birthday candles had been blown out, and where most of their lives had unfolded in quiet, everyday repetition. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the low hum of a neighbor's lawnmower echoed down the block. Inside, silence stretched between them, thick and waiting. Isabel placed one of Edward's letters in the center of the table, its creased paper and faded ink more eloquent than anything she could have said. Helen, who had been folding a dish towel, paused mid-motion, her fingers slowly unwrapping the fabric like someone uncertain whether to confront or preserve what lay beneath. When her eyes finally met the paper, they did not move quickly across the page. Instead, they held it as if recognizing something both precious and painful. Her hands trembled slightly, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice as thin as mist, she whispered, "I never thought you'd find these." Isabel didn't speak. She simply waited, not for answers, but for her mother's permission to remember aloud. And when Helen finally began to speak, it was not with the sharpness of defense, but with the softened rhythm of someone who had carried a story too long, too silently. "He used to come into the bookshop on Boylston," she said almost to herself, "always asking about poetry. At first I thought he was just lonely, a soldier far from home, but he listened to me, really listened." Helen described the slow unfolding of their affection, the walks through the common, the lunches eaten on borrowed time between his assignments, and the way she had laughed too loudly the night he tried to teach her how to waltz in the back room of the store after closing. It hadn't been some grand, sweeping romance like the movies made of war. It had been quieter, fiercely intimate, real. Then came the night he left. No warning, no real goodbye, just an urgent phone call and a promise. "I'll come back," that echoed inside her for years. "I wrote back," she said, "so many times, every week at first. I didn't know he never got them. Or maybe he did. I'll never know." Isabel reached out and gently touched her mother's hand, grounding her, letting her know she didn't have to protect anyone anymore. Not him, not her, not even herself. "I thought he forgot about me," Helen continued. "And then I found out I was pregnant. You." She looked up, her eyes full of a raw honesty Isabel had never seen. "I told no one who your father was, not even the man I married. I thought I was doing what was right, keeping peace, saving face, moving on. But part of me stayed in that bookstore, waiting for a letter that never came." Isabel swallowed the lump rising in her throat, not from anger, but from the immensity of all that had been left unsaid, decades compressed into this one fragile moment of truth. "Mom," she said quietly, "he's here in Boston. I found him." Helen's breath caught audibly, like a record skipping in the middle of a song. "What? What do you mean?" Isabel told her everything. The crosswalk, the photograph, the veteran's home in Cambridge, the way he had spoken her name, Lena, with a reverence that turned back the years. "He remembers you, Mom. He thought you were gone, but when I showed him your picture, It was like something came back to life." Helen's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She simply sat there, gripping the edges of the table as though the kitchen might otherwise vanish. "It's been 50 years. I know," Isabel said, "but he hasn't forgotten, and neither have you." The silence that followed wasn't painful this time. It was necessary, a space between what had been and what might still be. Finally, Helen stood. She moved to the cabinet above the stove, the one Isabel always thought held nothing but spices, and pulled down a small tin box. Inside were old photographs, a pressed flower, and a letter addressed to E.H. in her handwriting. Unsent, unopened, undisturbed for decades. "I never could throw it away," she said, "even when I remarried, even when I tried to forget." Isabel nodded, the pieces falling into place, not as shock, but as understanding, that her mother had always loved him, even through silence. "I want to see him," Helen said, her voice steady. "Not for closure, just to know." Isabel exhaled slowly. "We'll go tomorrow." And just like that, the past, long buried beneath duty, family and silence, took its first breath again. The next day arrived with a quiet stillness, the kind that seems to pause the world just long enough to give something sacred a moment to breathe. And as Isabel helped her mother into her navy blue coat, buttoning it slowly at the collar, she could see in Helen's eyes not just apprehension, but the fragile strength of someone about to step into a memory that had never quite faded. They drove in near silence across the Charles River, past familiar neighborhoods that felt suddenly distant, like pieces of another life seen through glass. And when they reached the modest entrance of the care facility in Cambridge, Isabel parked slowly, letting the engine idle for a few seconds longer than necessary before turning the key. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of linen and lemon polish, and as they walked together past quiet rooms and soft voices, Helen's grip on Isabel's hand grew tighter. Not out of fear, but from the sheer weight of what was waiting for her in the next breath. The nurse led them out to the garden, a peaceful space shaded by two towering oaks where a few residents sat reading or watching the afternoon pass. And there, on the far bench beneath a canopy of soft light, sat Edward, his back straight, his cane resting beside him, and his gaze turned gently upward, as if listening to something only he could hear. Helen stopped several feet away. She didn't speak, not at first. Her breath caught, and Isabel felt her mother's body stiffen with the kind of trembling that comes not from cold, but from decades of emotion finally being asked to move through the body. Then Edward turned. He looked directly at her, his eyes narrowing, not in confusion, but in concentration. as if some long-lost file in his memory had suddenly been pulled from the depths. His lips parted. His voice came out as a whisper. "Lena?" Helen took one small step forward. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking on the single syllable. They stood like that, facing one another across a lifetime, and then Helen slowly lowered herself onto the bench beside him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Edward, with trembling fingers, reached out and took her hand, and in that gesture, no explanation was needed. "I thought I had imagined you," he said, his voice thin but clear. "For years, I wondered if you were ever real, or just something the war gave and took in the same breath." "I was real," she replied, her eyes shining. "I still am." They talked, not hurriedly, not desperately, but with the slow tenderness of people who understood that time had taken much, but not everything. Edward told her about the letters he'd written after being shipped back to England, how he'd never stopped writing until the silence became too deafening to bear. Helen told him about Isabel, about the life she had built, and the pieces of herself she had hidden away to protect what remained. And then Edward, after a long pause, reached into the pocket of his cardigan and removed a small wooden box. "I've kept this with me all these years," he said, handing it to her. "I didn't know if I'd ever give it to you." Helen opened the lid slowly. Inside was a faded photo of them standing beside the Swan boats in the Boston Public Garden, a dried rose pressed between pages of a long-forgotten book, and a folded letter, unopened, addressed to her in his handwriting. She unfolded it gently and read the first lines aloud, her voice low, reverent. "My dearest Lena, if this finds you, know that I never left you willingly. You've lived in every heartbeat since." Isabel stood at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but unable to turn away. And in that moment, she understood something profound, that she had been born not just of circumstance or timing, but from a love so strong it had survived oceans, decades, and the cruelty of silence. For the next hour, they sat side by side, talking quietly, hands never parting until the sun began to drift low, casting the garden in a soft golden hue. Helen leaned her head gently on Edward's shoulder, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear of what memory might surface. As they prepared to leave, Edward held her gaze. "I don't know how much time I have left," he said, "but this was enough." Helen smiled softly. "No," she whispered, brushing her hand against his cheek. "This was everything." And as Isabel helped her mother to her feet, and they slowly made their way back through the hallway of quiet footsteps and gentle voices, she felt the weight of years lift, not disappear, but transform. And she knew that though life had stolen time from them, it had given something back too, a kind of peace that not even war could destroy. 3 months after that quiet afternoon in the garden, Edward Hargreaves passed away in his sleep, peacefully, without pain, with a letter from Helen folded beneath his pillow and a pressed rose resting beside it, as if time itself had finally stepped back and allowed something gentle to remain. The news came on a misty October morning, the kind where the city feels muffled and slowed, and when Isabel answered the phone and heard the nurse's voice, she sat silently in the kitchen, staring out at the leaves falling one by one, her chest both heavy and strangely still. Helen didn't cry at first. She simply nodded, walked upstairs and returned with the same tin box Isabel had seen before. This time, she opened it without hesitation, took out an envelope with Edward's name on it and began to write. She didn't ask Isabel what to say. She didn't reread or second-guess her words. And when she was done, she folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and held it against her chest for a long time before placing it gently into her handbag. At the small memorial, held under a canopy of gold and crimson trees in the corner of Mount Auburn Cemetery, only a handful of people gathered: a nurse from the care home, a retired airman who saluted with trembling fingers, a chaplain who read from the Psalms. But among them stood Helen, dressed not in black but in navy, her posture upright, her gaze soft and unbroken. When it came time to say goodbye, she stepped forward, removed the letter from her bag, and laid it on top of Edward's casket. "Now you'll know," she whispered. "All of it." Isabel watched from just a step behind, her heart filled with something too complex to name, not sorrow alone, but awe. For she had seen her mother transform, not into someone new, but into the woman she had once been, full of memory, strength, and truth. Weeks passed, then months, and one evening, sitting in her apartment surrounded by Edward's letters, Isabel began to type. She didn't write a novel, she didn't embellish, she simply let the truth shape the pages. The war, the silence, the waiting, the reunion, the forgiveness, and the love that, against all odds, had endured. When the book was published, a small, independent release titled "Until the War Fell Silent," it didn't make headlines or win awards, but it found its way into quiet hands. People who, like Edward and Helen, had waited for a voice, a sign, a page that sounded like their own. Helen read it in one sitting. When she finished, she closed the book, pressed her fingers to the cover and whispered, "Thank you." Because sometimes telling a story is how we give it back to the people who lived it. And sometimes helping a stranger cross the street is the first step in finding your way home. Not just to a place, but to a history that had always belonged to you. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that love, even lost, is never truly gone. New, true stories every day. Stories that heal, inspire, and stay with you.